How do we account for Frantz Fanon's abiding influence? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Adam Shatz. Adam Shatz is the US editor of the London Review of Books and host of the podcast Myself with Others. He is the author of Writers and Missionaries, Essays on the Radical Imagination, and most recently, The Rebel's Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon, issued in 2024. Adam Schatz, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Great to see you, Mouin.
When one considers the continuing prominence of Fanon in the revolutionary pantheon, it's easy to forget he died at the very young age of only 36. He was born in Martinique in the West Indies, became a French soldier and psychiatrist, Algerian revolutionary, and ultimately died of leukemia, as I said, at the age of 36, in, of all places, the United States, under the care of the CIA, which one would have assumed would be his nemesis. As the title of your book indicates, he lived revolutionary lives. How would you characterize, or what would you identify as the key turning points in his life, given that, as you noted, his life was full of not only achievements, but also in many respects contradictions?
Well, thank you, Mouin. And it is true that Fanon had a multifaceted and peripatetic life, and the subtitle of the book is meant to underscore just the plurality of that experience and the many revolutions in which he participated. Some of which were political, but of course others had to do with public health. I mean, he was a psychiatrist, and this book is, this book focuses also on his work as a medical doctor, which was so crucial to his political thinking. Fanon is born in colonial Martinique in 1925, and he grows up thinking of himself as a Frenchman, a French person of color.
And he had a very middle class upbringing, if I'm not mistaken.
Very middle class. His father was a customs inspector. The family was wealthy enough to afford piano lessons. They had servants. And Fanon did not think of himself as Black growing up. For him, Black people, and the word that they used was nègre, were the African soldiers, the tirailleurs sénégalais, who were a part of a unit in the French army, and he looked upon these African riflemen as a kind of exotic and slightly frightening curiosity. Eventually, his father invited some African riflemen over for dinner, a prospect that Fanon greeted with a certain degree of trepidation as a small boy. So it's really only when Fanon goes off to fight with the Free French forces to liberate France from fascism that he begins to realize that he's in a colonial army. It's an army that is sworn to oppose fascism, but it itself is permeated by racial divisions and hierarchies. Oddly enough, he's something of a beneficiary of them because French West Indians, as members of the so-called old colonies, were regarded as kind of honorary Europeans within that army.
They were a rung above the West Africans, for example.
Oh yeah, they were more than a rung above the West Africans and above Arabs. And so, and then after the war, he decides to study medicine. Eventually, he chooses psychiatry as his field. And at some point early on in his time in France, we don't know exactly when this happened, but it's clearly a pivotal moment in his life and kind of the primal scene of his thought, of his psychiatric thought. He's on a train, and a little boy with his mother looks at him. Looks at him in the way that he might have looked at the tirailleurs sénégalais, and looks at him in fear and says to his mother, "Maman, nègre, I'm frightened." And Fanon is startled and horrified and begins to look at himself as though he is an other, as though he's an object. And it's a moment that paralyzes him. And then after feeling that sense of paralysis, he responds with terror and with a desire to become violent. And ultimately, or rather in the period just after that incident, he embraces the Black consciousness philosophy of negritude and begins to assert himself as a Black man and to claim that he has, unique poetical powers, as he puts it, that he has some kind of privileged relationship with being by virtue of being Black, kind of metaphysical relationship to life. Fanon eventually rejects that kind of negritude. Still, that singeing episode reminds him of the way that he is seen in the eyes of French people. This colorblind ideology of the French is really doesn't hold for him, and it also leads him to explore larger questions of colonialism and identity. In fact, in his work as a doctor as well, when he's in Lyon, some of his first patients are Algerian workers who are living in these very isolated, segregated circumstances. They're sleeping 6 or 7 to a room. They're sending home remittances, and they're suffering from a kind of mysterious illness, a psychosomatic illness that.
This is still all prior to the Algerian War of
Oh,
Independence.
it's prior. Yeah, this is several years before he goes to Algeria.
Mhm.
And Fanon has been told by other doctors that this is the North African syndrome. That's what it's called. The North African syndrome is a kind of hallucination, or it could be an excuse not to go to work. They're North Africans. They're lazy. They don't want to go to work. They're making something up. And Fanon was led in a different direction. He had a different intuition. He argued in one of his early articles, the so-called North African syndrome, that they were being made sick by racism, in fact. And so, interestingly, well before Fanon arrives in Algeria, he's faced with the so-called Algerian problem. He's not yet situating it in the context of a liberation struggle against the French, but he sees that these Algerians, who've been told that they're French, um, are in fact not, and that the illnesses that they suffer are a sign of a kind of existential crisis, the existential crisis of people who have been forcibly deracinated, you might say. So it's really that encounter with French racism and his understanding that this ideology of liberty, equality, and freedom, which he had embraced, which he had absorbed as a child in Martinique, was full of hypocrisy, and that's really what kind of launches him on his path both as a doctor and as a political thinker.
So he was already on this trajectory, one could say, before he arrived in Algeria. Nevertheless, he did arrive in Algeria very much as a Frenchman.
Oh,
Um,
he did. He arrived in Algeria not for any political reason. He had recently been married, and
to a
his
French woman, if I'm not
to a
mistaken.
French woman, to a French woman. His job prospects in France were not particularly good. He had not done terribly well on his examinations. He had published a book, a remarkable study of racism that at the time was largely ignored, called Black Skin, White Masks. Um, and he had thought about going to Senegal, but and had written to Leopold Senghor, the bard of the Negritude movement, but Senghor had never replied, possibly because Senghor had read Black Skin, White Mask and had seen that Fanon treated him with a certain degree of contempt.
Because Fanon was already moving away from
He'd already
identity
moved.
politics.
He'd already moved away from the Songorian version of negritude with its belief in a kind of mystical blackness. He was much closer to the negritude philosophy of the poet Aimé Césaire, a Martinican poet and statesman who was Fanon's mentor in many ways. Fanon actually campaigned for Césaire when Césaire ran for mayor in 1946 in Fort-de-France, and so yes, but when he arrives in Algeria, he's arriving as a colonial administrator. It was quite common for the French to send educated and assimilated. The term was évoluer, evolved, as if they'd evolved to a higher stage of humanity.
Had been civilized.
They had been civilized. It was common for the French to send the noirs évolués, the evolved blacks, to the new colonies, to places like Algeria, as representatives of France. They were supposed to sort of represent, the glory and potential of civilization. And so that's how Fanon got his first major posting, which was at the Blida-Joinville Psychiatric Hospital. This was in November 1953. No sign of any revolt. There had been a nationalist uprising in Sétif and Guelma in 1945, and the
Long
French,
before he arrived.
long before he arrived, and the French had crushed it brutally. About 15,000 Algerians were killed, and the military commander who presided over the quote-unquote pacification operation said, I've given you 10 years, and if you don't fix this problem in 10 years, you're going to see something just as bad. And he was off only by a year, because 9 years later, 11 months after Fanon arrived in Blida-Joinville, at the Blida-Joinville hospital, the FLN launched its liberation war. And by then, Fanon,
54.
November 54. And by then, Fanon had already taken a growing interest in the lives and cultural practices of Algerian Muslims. About half of his patients were Algerian men, and the other half of his patients were European women. They were separated. They were in different pavilions. The hospital was a kind of almost like an apartheid space. And the psychiatrist who had shaped the practice of psychiatry at the hospital was a man named Antoine Porot, whose legacy Fanon would go on to combat, because Porot, although in some ways a psychiatric modernizer, was a passionate believer in racial hierarchy and posited that Algerian Muslims were mentally inferior. And Fanon saw the effects of the Porot model as soon as he got there. He saw these men wandering around listlessly and essentially being treated as inmates of a concentration camp. In effect, the conditions that he found in Blida-Joinville were very similar to the ones that prevailed in most French psychiatric hospitals during the Second World War, when about 40 or 50,000 people died. It was called the extermination douce, the soft extermination. Fanon had the good fortune of working at a different psychiatric hospital in France called the Saint-Alban Asylum, where no one had died during the war because the doctors were members of the resistance, and they had made sure that the population of Saint-Alban would be protected and would be fed.
And Fanon then eventually leaves, defects, whatever term one wants to use, and joins the National Liberation Front, the Algerian National Liberation Front, FLN, and becomes rather prominent in it as a representative, as a spokesperson. I'm curious to what extent not only what he witnesses in Algeria, but to what extent his study and practice of psychiatry played a role in this transition.
Oh, well, I think very much so. When the revolt broke out in November 1954, Fanon was immediately sympathetic, because he saw these resistance fighters at the FLN, whom very few people knew about. It was a new group, an offshoot of an older group. He immediately regarded them as young men of audacity who wanted to change this dreadful state of affairs. In fact, he even offered to fight with the FLN. Of course, he did not fight with the FLN, but he ended up making contact with the FLN through circles of Christian progressives in Algiers, people like the Dr. Pierre Chollet, who was from a settler family that had arrived in the 1830s, but who had become an early member of the FLN. And his sister was married to an Algerian Muslim Salah Louanchi, who was an FLN leader in clandestinity, of course. Fanon, through his work as a psychiatrist in Algeria, came to regard colonialism as inflicting an acute form of alienation and as essentially making it impossible for Algerians, whether they were mentally ill or not, to realize themselves as human beings.
Mhm.
Um, Mental illness was the acute form of the pathology of colonialism.
Mhm.
And during his time at the Blida-Joinville Hospital during the war, he would go on to work not just with fighters who had been wounded or who suffered from psychological wounds, what we now call PTSD.
Yes.
He was also treating the perpetrators. He was treating French soldiers who had been involved in torture. In one case, he saw a French torturer who wanted Fanon to cure him of his acute anguish so that he could torture in serenity. And that's where Fanon drew the line and said, I can't help you anymore. My role is not to help you become a better torturer. But he was willing to work for the most part with both the victims and the perpetrators. He also observed truly horrifying things, such as, and he recounts this in the last chapter of The Wretched of the Earth on colonial warfare and mental disorders, such things as a group of Algerian boys, 12, 13 years old, who had killed a friend of theirs, a European friend of theirs, um, uh, as a kind of almost as an act of resistance, even though this boy had been one of their closest friends. And Fanon is clearly, horrified by this. That he sees uh, both colonialism and the colonial war as inflicting kind of psychic damage, on everyone. Of course, his sympathies lay with the colonized and with the struggle for liberation, but he also saw the ways in which colonialism disfigured the moral capacities of everyone in what was a brutal and dirty war. Um, so during his time there, Fanon came to know people who were leading the rebellion in this particular wilaya. And they were, for the most part, Kabyle Berbers who were socialists or Marxists, people of the left. And Fanon came to believe that the Algerian rebellion represented a kind of universal rebellion for human liberation.
And because I mean he's most closely identified, of course, with the Algerian rebellion and struggle for independence. But his commitments, as you say, were very much universal rather than specific to Algeria. And this is reflected, I think, also very clearly in his writings, where he talks about much broader themes than only those that were transpiring in Algeria.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he saw the Algerian revolt as part of a sequence of revolts against colonialism and injustice, and what as a psychiatrist he referred to as alienation. The struggle for liberation was a struggle for what he called disalienation. It was a term that he had learned when he was working as a psychiatrist in France, working under a Catalan psychiatrist named François Tosquelles. And in effect, Fanon became the François Tosquelles of the Algerian rebellion. Tosquelles had worked with the Spanish Republican forces, Fanon with the Algerians. And in those years he was in Algeria, he began to speak to conferences. I mean, he for example, he was in France at the time of the 1956 Conference of Black Writers and Artists, a conference that James Baldwin reported on. They didn't meet. It's tantalizing to imagine the meeting, but they did not, so far as we know. In late 1956, the Battle of Algiers breaks out, and uh, most of the people in Fanon's circles are under direct threat and have to flee the country and to find exile in other parts of North Africa or Egypt.
Mm.
And Fanon himself realizes that his days in Algeria are numbered, and he submits his resignation, and in a remarkable and eloquent letter in which he says that he's powerless as a psychiatrist. There's no way that he can do his work in a place like Algeria under French rule. And he goes to France, and through his contacts in the circles of the porteurs de valises, the baggage carriers who were supporting the FLN, led in fact by a man named Francis Janson, a philosopher who was a protege of Sartre and who had been the editor of Fanon's first book, Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon is able to leave France secretly, and through Italy eventually gets to Tunisia, where the FLN has its headquarters, and there he becomes a spokesman for the GPRA, the provisional government of the Algerian Republic, which is formed in '58. But he's already a spokesman for the FLN, and he's also editing and writing for El Mujahid, the FLN newspaper. At the same time, and it's quite extraordinary, he's working as a very innovative doctor. And eventually Fanon establishes the first neuropsychiatric day clinic in independent Africa. So he's really, I mean, he's firing on all cylinders. He's working as a doctor, he's working as a journalist, he's working as a spokesman.
Mm-hmm.
And for Fanon, there's really, it all goes hand in hand, because he sees his work as a psychiatrist as very much a part of this liberation.
Nothing is compartmentalized in his life.
No, certainly not. No.
And he never lives to see an independent Algeria. Nevertheless, he was prophetic, if you will, in pointing out that the purpose of liberation struggle is not just in Algeria, but elsewhere. The aspiration should reach beyond simply replacing the colonial rulers with indigenous ones. And I think for many of his readers, this was one of his key messages.
It was. No, he was very prescient in that regard. And part of it, I think, one reason why he was so prescient is that he was observing the transformation of the FLN in Tunisia. Now, Fanon does travel widely. He eventually becomes the traveling ambassador for the FLN based in Accra. And he's going to various African capitals and meeting people like Patrice Lumumba and Sekou Touré and others. But I think it's really important to underline that when Fanon gets to Tunis, he is encountering a different FLN. The FLN that he had come to admire and to revere, in fact, was the so-called FLN of the interior. And at the time, it was led by a man named Aban Ramdan, who was the architect of the Soumam platform, which essentially created the Algerian state and established independent Algeria's political program. Aban Ramdan was quite a visionary modernist leader, very charismatic. And one of the great themes of Aban Ramdan's ideology was that the political should have primacy over the military. In other words, people of politics should govern the liberation movement, not generals. And when Fanon gets to Tunis, he finds very
It's the opposite.
It's the absolute opposite. It is the army of the frontiers and the intelligence services that determine the shape of the Algerian Revolution. The army of the frontiers is led by Houari Boumediene, who eventually becomes Algeria's leader after a military coup in 1965. And the head of the intelligence services is a man named Abdelhafid Boussouf, who is in some ways the most fundamental figure in the FLN of the exterior, because he is essentially creating what will become the spinal cord of a police state.
Mm-hmm. The national security state.
Exactly. And Fanon, Aban Ramdan came to Tunis as well. He left at the same time that Fanon did. And probably about 7 or 8 months after Fanon's arrival in Tunis, Aban Ramdan is lured to Morocco by his comrades, and he's strangled to death under the orders of Abdelhafid Boussouf.
And Fanon has to
Fanon's aware of it.
Present apologetics for this.
Yeah, Fanon's aware of it. I mean, he knows that Aban Ramdan did not die on the field of honor, as he as it was presented in El Mujahid. He knows that, but he doesn't really have much choice, because if he is identified with a faction that is standing up to defend the memory of Aban Ramdan against the army of the frontiers, he'd be in a very tricky position. I mean, he could have been liquidated. And according to the historian Mohammed Harbi, who knew Fanon in Tunis, he was a member of the FLN at the time, Fanon was on a list. He was on a list of people to be killed if there were an internal challenge to the leadership. So Fanon and that's another tension that I mean to underscore in this book: the tension between being this sort of rebellious dissident, hence the Rebels Clinic. I'm saying that Fanon's rebellious thought takes shape in these spaces of confinement, in places like these, the day clinic, in the hospital, and so on. But then there's Fanon, the revolutionary bureaucrat, whose room of maneuver is much more limited.
As it is with people in his position.
Exactly. And my purpose is not to say one good, one bad. I mean, I think it's much more complicated, because Fanon is actually able to do some very interesting things once he's inside the movement, but there is a price to pay as well. And so Fanon is also seeing the development of what he calls a national bourgeoisie, of a privileged caste within the Algerian Revolution.
And he writes about it in absolutely scathing terms.
He writes about it in scathing terms, and he uses, and the language that he uses is also quite striking. For example, when he writes about the danger that in post-independence African states there will simply be a replacement of the colonizer by the colonized, by the elite.
It's the pitfalls of national consciousness, I believe.
Exactly, and he refers to it he doesn't even use the word Africanization. He actually says négrification, negrification. It's an even more bitter, insulting description of what happens. No, he was very concerned that there would be no fundamental structural change, and that the structures of colonial rule would be reproduced with different personnel.
Neo-colonialism, in effect.
Exactly.
And you've traveled to Algeria often over the years, and you've interviewed many people, both about this book, including people who had interacted directly with Fanon. Fanon was not an Arab, he was not a Muslim, he was deeply committed to the cause of Algerian independence and was a prominent member of its liberation movement. How is he remembered in Algeria today?
That's a very complicated question. I mean, I think that if you were to ask the average Algerian about Frantz Fanon, that person probably would not even know who Frantz Fanon is. Okay, I mean, the first thing to acknowledge is that he's not that well remembered. I mean, among the masses of Algerians, I mean, they might associate him with a street, because there are streets named after him. La Rue Docteur Fanon. And the assumption, it's quite amusing, is that he's a French doctor. Okay. Which is hardly how Fanon would have wanted to be remembered. I mean, he'd done everything to liberate himself of his
French.
Exactly. So now there was some discomfort about Fanon after the revolution succeeded, after independence in 1962, for a number of reasons. I mean, one was that Fanon had really not been particularly interested in Algeria's own political traditions, in Islam, for example. And so there were more, you might call them neo-traditionalists, who identified Fanon with a wing of the FLN that they didn't particularly care for. And it's true, of course, that Fanon didn't have a very deep appreciation for the specificities of Algerian nationalism. I mean, there are other figures.
Had a universal agenda, if you will.
He did. Now, but when I say that, I also want to emphasize that there were other Algerians in the movement who shared Fanon's vision.
Exactly.
So it's not as though he was simply projecting his wishes. There were other people in the FLN who were similar to Fanon, and his closest friends in the movement had a similar vision. They ended up being a minority current. Now, what I will say though is that there has been, I think, growing interest in Fanon among younger Algerians, younger educated Algerians who are understandably fed up with living under a highly autocratic, increasingly autocratic regime.
They're fed up with the faction that won.
Well, it's funny because the faction that ultimately won, some would argue, is the déserteurs de l'armée française, the deserters of the French army, the Algerian officers who were in the French army until very late in the war, and then when it became clear that the French were going to lose, they switched sides. So, I mean, the side that won was not necessarily the historic FLN. It was, one could argue it was opportunists who joined later, but that's a very complicated historical debate that we can't get into right now. But what's interesting about the return to Fanon among some younger Algerians is that they're not reading him so much for his critique of colonization or his advocacy of armed struggle. They're reading him because of essays like The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, to which you referred earlier, or his critique of the national bourgeoisie, because Fanon saw far in advance what independent Algeria might become. I mean, he was very worried about this. He spoke explicitly about that danger to Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre when he met them in Rome in 1961, shortly before his death. He, in fact, predicted that thousands of people would die after independence, which is exactly what happened. There was a terrible score settling after the war. Many Algerians who had been accused of being Harkis, of fighting with the French, were slaughtered, but not all of them were Harkis. Some of them were killed were accused by people who themselves might have collaborated. It was a very murky situation.
Sounds a bit like France in 45.
It was. There were certainly parallels. And yet another reason that Fanon has, I think, become important to younger Algerians who, the younger Algerians who were flooding the streets every Friday for the Hirak demonstrations until recently, is that Fanon had a conception of Algerian identity that was multi-ethnic, that was, I'm not sure if I would call it secular, but it was not religious. I mean, his view was that anyone who wanted to build an independent Algeria free of French colonialism could call themselves an Algerian. And there were other, and it needs to be remembered that there were other people in the FLN who made the same argument. Aban Ramdan certainly did. And that ideology lost. And after the War of Independence, citizenship and religion were closely tied. And Algeria also saw the emergence of some of the worst laws on things like divorce and women's rights. And I think that Fanon is a source of inspiration to them for that reason.
The other aspect with which Fanon, and at least in the public consciousness, is so closely identified. We've talked about the national bourgeoisie and so on. The other one, of course, is his embrace of armed struggle, and what some see even as his advocacy of revolutionary violence for its cleansing effects. How would you characterize our understanding or misunderstanding of Fanon's views on armed struggle and revolutionary violence?
Yeah, this is a tough nut to crack, and I try to do this in the book, and I'm not going to claim that I've done a thorough job. I mean, it's we could argue endlessly over this. My own view is that Fanon, of course, is an advocate of armed struggle, and that he does attribute certain therapeutic properties to armed struggle.
And this goes back to his experience and expertise in psychiatry, would you say?
Yeah, I think part of it has to do with his expertise in psychiatry, but in my view, it has it has a deeper cause. It's not. It's had less to do with his psychiatric observations, because his psychiatric observations run in both directions. I mean, in his psychiatry, he finds that violence can liberate, but he also finds that violence can create new traps. Violence can foreclose certain destinies. And the last chapter of the book gives a much bleaker account of the effects of violence on the psyches of the colonized. So the psychiatric effects are ambiguous, I think. I think the reason that he has such a full-throated defense of armed struggle, although there are nuances that I want to mention, the reason that he has such a full-throated defense, though, of armed struggle has to do with his relationship to the West Indies. Fanon, it's really important to remember, is a West Indian thinker. He's from Martinique. He is shaped by the experience of being a French Martinican, of being an Antillean. And he's growing up in one of the old colonies where people have basically accepted that they are French, and he has a sense of shame about this. And that shame permeates Black Skin, White Masks, which is as much a critique of West Indians as it is a critique of racism. Essentially, he argues that in 1848, with abolition, which was presided over by a man named Victor Schellcher,
The abolition of slavery and
the abolition of slavery, and Victor Schellcher, the architect of abolition, he was ubiquitous in Martinique. There were statues all over the place. The school the lycée that Fanon attended was the Victor Schellcher Lycée. In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon argues that that in 1848, with the abolition of slavery, freedom was granted as if it were a kind of gift. There was no struggle. The black man, I think he puts it in somewhere in Black Skin, White Mask, was acted upon. And this was in stark contrast with the conquest of freedom through force of arms in Haiti. Now, of course, the story of Haiti becomes a very tragic one, and France continues to punish Haiti for having revolted and won its freedom. But in Fanon's view, and Fanon is very much a reader of Hegel, especially of the chapter on the struggle between the Lord and the bondsman, in Fanon's view, freedom is not an authentic freedom. It's only a counterfeit freedom if it is not fought for.
So, in other words, freedom requires agency.
Exactly. And, this is the funny thing is, Fanon's advocacy of violence is depicted as though it were cruel and perverse and so on, but you find echoes of Fanon's argument in, let's say, and I point this out in the book, in Frederick Douglass. When does Frederick Douglass feel most like a man? When he is enslaved? It's when he fights against Covey, the overseer. It's when he fights him and shows his power. We find this in the writings of the Holocaust survivor and resistance fighter Jean Améry, Hans Meyer, who, writing on Fanon in 1969 in Les Temps Modernes, declared that the violence of the oppressed is an affirmation of humanity. Jean Améry was a Fanonian, right? So these ideas are treated as if they're, gratuitously violent and frightening, but Fanon is part of a community of thinkers who have reached similar conclusions. But I do think the West Indian experience is fundamental here, and I do think it's one reason why he had such admiration for the Algerians, because he saw the Algerians as a people who had refused the mask, who had refused to become French, and who were bent on fighting for self-determination. And in his own view, the Martinicans had surrendered. So that I think there's a biographical aspect to it. Now, if we look at his arguments about armed struggle in the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth on violence, we find that while he certainly argues in favor of armed struggle and sees it as having this disintoxicating effect, that's his word, it's not cleansing, but disintoxicating, freeing the colonized from feelings of lethargy, hopelessness, and futility, he does not celebrate it as unconditionally as Sartre in the preface, this notorious preface, which is a great piece of writing, very ecstatic, very imaginative, very eloquent,
but distorts in a
but
sense.
distorts the meaning, I think, of Fanon's writing. Fanon is also emphatic that the identities of settler and native are not essential, they're not fixed, that if there is an overthrow of colonialism, the identities of colonized and colonizer no longer exist. They disappear with the end of colonialism.
Mhm.
And he argues that while it's entirely understandable that the colonized at the beginning of a liberation struggle would regard any member of the colonizer community as an enemy, as a legitimate target, at a certain point, a liberation struggle has to find allies among the colonizing community, people who share the belief that the country should be decolonized, that people should be free. And in fact, he writes that the colonized may find that some members of the colonizing community are blacker than the blacks.
And these are not concepts often associated with Fanon, even by those who have read him.
No, nor do people remember that he writes that that hatred, a legitimate desire for vengeance, and anti-racist racism cannot nurture a liberation struggle. So it's these cautionary moments in Fanon that tend to be forgotten. People forget too, I think, that chapter on violence just is a narrative. It describes the different stages in a liberation struggle and the kind of the stages of consciousness that emerge within it. Fanon is often, I think, characterized as this almost bloodthirsty believer,
Caricatured.
a believer in terror. What some people would call terrorism. But this is the question is why, and I think it's and to me, it has to do with race, because Sartre writes the most incendiary chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, and yet Sartre is remembered as a thinker of many dimensions, who wrote on many subjects, who at the end of the day was a visionary humanistic philosopher. I mean, we may argue that he got certain things wrong, that he failed to reckon with the Gulag early enough and so forth, but he is credited with being a complex human being of many dimensions. And yet Fanon is reduced to being the prophet of violence. Now, I think there's an answer for that in Fanon's own writings, in Black Skin, White Masks, where he writes that in the white imagination, the black man represents the biological. The black man represents all of these unsavory instincts, all these violent impulses that the white man does not want to admit having himself, and so he projects them onto the black person. I think we see a similar process with the mischaracterization of Fanon.
And Fanon's best-known work, The Wretched of the Earth, was a race against time. He, I think, had already been diagnosed with leukemia when he began dictating it. And it was published posthumously, if I'm not mistaken.
It was actually published in the last days of his life. It was published 3 or 4 days before he died. So he was aware that it was being confiscated in French bookstores.
And ironically, he had gone to great lengths to get Sartre to write the introduction to it.
He did, and because he had immense admiration for Sartre, and he had a running dialogue with him for many years. I mean, there's, the Black Skin, White Mask is very influenced by Sartre, and Fanon is in a kind of respectful argument with him about negritude, and The Wretched of the Earth owes a great deal to Sartre's book, The Critique of Dialectical Reason. And at the same time, Sartre is someone who is increasingly influenced by the anti-colonial struggle. And to Sartre's credit, he begins to reevaluate his entire philosophical project in light of the anti-colonial struggle and in light of contributions by people like Fanon. So they have a kind of fascinating dialectic.
And you, in your book, you also discuss Sartre's gradual progression from calling for a peaceful settlement without openly supporting the FLN and being influenced by Henri Alleg's book about torture, to in the end embracing um, the Algerian armed struggle in ways that perhaps even Fanon himself hadn't, as you were just indicating. But now,
I think Fanon had it. I think, one of the things that, we I think we tend to forget about the FLN is that although there are certainly, the FLN certainly committed, horrifying acts like all liberation groups. It's certainly true, and killed many Algerians and was engaged in brutal factional battles with the MNA, the Algerian National Movement led by Masali Haj. That's all true. But at the same time, the leaders of the FLN did not have what I would call uh, they did not have these exaggerated notions of what violence would do for Algerian humanity. And for them, I think violence was a tool. It was a
yeah,
tool that worked in concert with their diplomatic revolution, with the work of,
which they invested in very heavily.
oh, absolutely. I mean, people like Mohammed Yazid were crucial to the victory in the independence struggle. They had fantastic people working at the UN. So, and at a certain point in the Algerian struggle, especially after the Battle of Algiers, when the interior FLN was crushed, the Algerians had to rely more and more on international diplomacy to achieve their ends.
Finally, I'd like to discuss Fanon's abiding influence. For example, you quote the Palestinian leader Abu Iyad in his memoir. He discussed the revelatory experience of reading Fanon in the Fatah training camps. Then you also discuss Edward Said's discussion and study of Fanon, who I think gives an interpretation of Fanon that's also quite different from the one Sartre gave that you were just discussing. And then interestingly enough, he also becomes, perhaps icon is too strong a word, but in movements such as Black Lives Matter and more contemporary ones, Fanon is very much present. How do you explain that it is precisely Fanon who is latched onto by so many and so disparate movements over the decades?
It's hard to disentangle in this case the force of Fanon's personality and life from the force of his writing. I think both are important. I mean, Fanon was the exemplary, committed intellectual engagé, and so there is an aura to his life, which I think can't be discounted among the reasons for his influence and prestige. I mean, he's someone who throws himself into battle on behalf of a people who are not his own people. It's quite extraordinary when you think
But
about
are his own people in the way that he looked at this as a universal
it.
cause?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's an unfashionable idea, but I think it's also a very seductive idea.
Mm,
That he came to see the Algerians. He came to see himself as an Algerian,
mm.
eventually as an African, in fact. Uh, I think that exerts a great deal of influence and commands a lot of respect, certainly. But it's also Fanon's writing. It's this the in the case of the early PLO, figures like Abu Iyad. Um, it certainly had a great deal to do with Fanon's writings about armed struggle
Mm.
and his understanding of the psychological importance of armed struggle. I mean, Mouin, you've probably forgotten more than I know about the Palestinian armed struggle, but I think that we can agree that a pivotal moment in Palestinian armed struggle and Palestinian national consciousness is the Battle of Karameh in
In
Jordan
1968.
in
Yeah.
1968. I
Mm.
mean, this was a classically Fanonian moment. The Battle of Karameh is not a battle where the PLO won. I mean, there was no way they were going to defeat the Israeli army,
But
uh,
like the Algerians, it's one where they didn't lose.
but they didn't lose and they fought valiantly. And the effect of the example
Mm.
of the Battle of Karameh led to massive recruitment among young Palestinians. I think there were 20 or 30,000 new PLO soldiers within weeks of the Battle of Karameh. And Yasser Arafat said something at the time of the Battle of Karameh that could have been written by Fanon when he said that we are no longer
Numbers.
defeated. We are no longer defeated and humiliated refugees. We're fighters.
Yeah.
And essentially that's what Fanon is saying in the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, that by taking up arms, the colonized remake themselves as human beings capable of becoming masters of their own destiny.
And I think you can make clear parallels for a variety of reasons between the Palestinians and the Algerians. So that perhaps
But
is.
they're strong parallels. There are very strong parallels.
But then
Absolutely.
if we look further afield, for example, more recently in the Black Lives Matter movement, I
Yeah.
think you write also about his influence
Well,
there.
I think there, Fanon. Well, first of all, Fanon was an analytic writer, but he was also a very visceral writer.
Mhm.
Not unlike James Baldwin, in fact. Although Baldwin is much easier to read than Fanon, but Fanon had a flair for phrases that capture what you might call the existential nature of political struggle for oppressed people.
Mhm.
And so, for example, in Black Skin, White Masks, he writes that famously that people don't revolt on behalf of a specific culture, and he was referring rather disdainfully to the ideas of the negritude movement. They don't revolt on behalf of a culture. They revolt when they can no longer breathe. And it so of course, the Black Lives Matter movement emerges in response to the police killings of young Black people.
Mhm.
And famously, Eric Garner and George Floyd,
Can't
uh,
breathe. Mhm.
they could not breathe, and they said they couldn't breathe as they were dying. And so that line of Fanon seems to speak directly to that horror.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, such a short life, but such a long shadow.
a very long shadow. I mean, Fanon arguably is I think is more important after his death than he was in his own lifetime.
Mhm.
Fanon, when he dies, is a person who has a certain cachet in radical and anti-colonial and Pan-Africanist circles. He's certainly respected. He's read by a lot of young African leaders. He's read by French radicals and the movements supporting the FLN, but he's not a famous person. And
Mhm.
his thought is only beginning to travel. It's really after his death that he becomes a thinker of global significance, thanks certainly to people like Edward Said, who was one of his finest interpreters, most eloquent interpreters. But I think, above all, thanks to the Black American readers who discovered and promoted him in the late 1960s. And this
Black Panthers and so on.
Black Panthers, very much so the Black Panthers. And, it's assumed, understandably, that the Black Panthers celebrated Fanon because of his writings on armed struggle, and there's some truth to that. But the Black Panthers were also very interested in Fanon's writings on the corruption of medicine by colonial ideology, and they were reading their doctors were reading the essay on medicine and colonialism and dying colonialism in their health clinics, because
Interesting.
if anyone understood how profound medical miscarriage could be, it was Black Americans who
Hmm.
had traumatic memories of things like the Tuskegee experiments
Yeah.
or forced sterilization. They did not regard medicine as neutral.
Hmm.
Medicine could
And it
actually,
wasn't.
it
Hmm.
was not. It was not. It could be a hostile encounter with a white doctor. And at the same time, Black doctors who were not themselves political radicals, like the Harvard psychiatrist Alvin Poussin, were reading Fanon. And there was a section of the library of the Harvard Medical School dedicated to Fanon by a group of Black psychiatrists. The whole idea of Black rage, which became a theme in Black psychiatric writings in the late 60s, owed a lot to Fanon.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Adam Shatz, it's been a fascinating conversation. Very grateful to you for sharing your insights about your new book, The Rebels Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon with Connections. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mouin.